A 5-year-old boy vanished right in the middle of a crowded park and was initially treated as just wandering off for a few minutes and he'll come back. But the story was anything but that simple. In the blink of an eye, case shifted from a routine search to a serious abduction investigation that would drag on for decades. The man believed to be directly involved in the boy's disappearance carried a series of mysteries about his identity, movements, and motives that no one could explain. This was a child who was only 5 years old, while the man was already over 30, with a level of preparation and concealment that even the police at the time couldn't keep up with. Over the years, many people believed the boy might have been taken by someone to raise, but I don't think so, and I'll explain why. In the description below, there's an entire playlist of cold cases solved through DNA, definitely worth listening to, because they tell the stories of journeys that brought the truth back to light after decades of being buried. Before we dive deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love these journeys in pursuit of forgotten justice, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Charlotte, summer 1960, was a city expanding rapidly with quiet streets, residential neighborhoods full of magnolia trees, and the sound of trains from the Southern Railway echoing through every afternoon, creating the feeling of a safe, familiar community, where children were often allowed to run and play freely in the parks without anyone thinking of danger. In that setting, the Murphy family lived in the Dilworth area. Thomas worked as a railroad mechanic. Eleanor was an elementary school teacher, and the neighbor boy Caleb Turner, 9 years old, often went with Henry to Freedom Park every weekend, a simple, steady lifestyle that gave no warning of any upheaval. Henry Murphy, 5 years old, was seen as an obedient, gentle child who clung to his mother, but was very curious about the world around him. He loved rubber balls the most, loved running along the paths by the lake to chase the echoing sound of trains, and always looked up to Caleb like a big brother. He trusted completely. That day the whole family took Henry to Freedom Park. Thomas stood near the grass watching his son play with the ball, while Eleanor kept an eye on the two kids from just a few steps away, chatting with a woman from the neighborhood. In that familiar rhythm of activity, a strange man appeared at the edge of the park, not making noise, not approaching anyone directly, just standing in the shade by the row of trees, smoking a cigarette and directing his gaze toward the grassy area where Henry and Caleb were chasing the ball. Caleb was the first to notice this presence, an unclear feeling but one that made him watch longer than usual, while Eleanor only caught a glimpse of the figure and assumed it was someone stopping to rest. The abnormality became clearer as the man slowly moved toward the path, each time getting closer while looking directly at the area where Henry was running back and forth. No one in the family realized the level of focus the stranger had on the child, because Thomas was busy scraping mud off his shoes, and Eleanor was distracted when she bent down to help another child tie their shoelaces, and that very moment of looking away created a critical gap in supervision. Henry kicked the ball off course. It rolled farther than usual toward the path, near where the man was standing. The boy ran after the ball without looking back. Caleb called out but Henry didn't hear, and in the next few seconds, the man stepped out from the trees, bent down to pick up the ball, then took one more step closer to Henry, his movements decisive, but not too fast, enough to avoid drawing attention from anyone around. Caleb started running toward Henry to pull him back, but tripped on the edge of the path, and when he looked up, Henry was no longer in the previous spot. Thomas noticed Henry out of sight just a few dozen seconds later, and immediately ran toward the path. Eleanor panicked and called her son's name, drawing the attention of those nearby. Within a minute, many people rushed to search around the grass by the lake and along the paths but saw no sign of Henry. Caleb, in a state of panic, tried to describe that there had been a man near Henry, but couldn't remember the face or any specific details, beyond the feeling that he was wearing a light-colored shirt and standing next to a car far off toward the exit. After nearly an hour of chaotic searching, with no trace, no responding sound, Eleanor began to tremble, while Thomas shifted from calling his son's name to wandering aimlessly between the paths, clinging to any hope. The hopelessness grew with each passing minute without result, and finally both had to accept that Henry was no longer within the park's boundaries. Thomas returned to the grass, his face pale, while Eleanor could no longer stay calm, and in that moment they agreed that delaying further would only lose more hope. So Thomas ran to the payphone near the park gate and reported to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, CMPD, that their son Henry Murphy, 5 years old, had disappeared. The forces at Freedom Park began expanding search operations across the entire area, after initial information was consolidated at the temporary command table, with the goal of sweeping every path, lake edge, and thickly wooded spot where a child could have accidentally wandered or been taken through. Patrol groups were divided by section, using fan formations to cover the ground systematically, while the communications support unit continuously updated from nearby traffic posts to cross-reference with the description of the light-colored Bel Air that appeared in multiple witness statements. Areas previously trampled by the public were remarked to avoid confusion in the sweep. However, the scene had been disturbed so much that the chance of extracting footprints or drag marks became very low. The search operation was simultaneously combined with compiling all timing data provided by witnesses related to Henry's position before he vanished. The investigation team relied on statements from Caleb, the woman on the grass, and 2 witnesses near the exit to determine the last time Henry was seen near the path, by the trees, from which they created a map distributing everyone's positions at the time of observation. This data was entered into a preliminary table to reconstruct the critical 90-minute period around Henry's disappearance, including the strange man's appearances, the children's movements in the area, and unusual vehicle departures from the park. The quick compilation table revealed some coincidences: the strange man seen before the disappearance, Henry running after the ball toward the path, and a light-colored car seen leaving the park in the immediately following time frame. The investigation team still faced a critical gap in the event sequence that no witness could fill. No one saw the moment Henry made direct contact with the man or him leaving the area via the path, or being taken to a car. This gap forced the team to classify it as a moment that could not be accurately reconstructed, making it harder to determine the subject's direction of movement. The search team continued expanding to places a child could slip, fall or hide from view, such as under small wooden bridges, bushes by the lake, water edges and paths leading to side parking lots. All were swept in grid patterns, but still yielded no physical evidence like shoes, clothing fragments, toys or signs Henry had passed through. The list of checked locations grew rapidly, but it didn't create any new leads for investigators. In summarizing the sweep that extended into the next morning, CMPD noted that the entire first 24-hour search yielded no valuable physical evidence. Witness statements were inconsistent about the car color and the strange man's features, and the 90-minute timeline still retained large gaps, unexplained by available data. The only thing strengthened by the search was the plausibility of the hypothesis that Henry had been taken out of the park by motor vehicle, as there was no evidence supporting the possibility he was still within Freedom Park boundaries or could have moved to farther areas on foot. The matching information from multiple witnesses about a light blue Chevrolet Bel Air leaving Freedom Park at the exact time Henry disappeared led CMPD to decide to shift to pursuing the vehicle as a new investigative priority, and the first step was to screen all light blue Bel Airs registered within Mecklenburg County. The initial raw list stretched to more than 1,700 vehicles, most from the popular model years of the 90s, forcing investigators to filter by the paint code recorded by the DMV, excluding those in dark blue, teal, or vehicles whose owners had reported a color change. When the list was narrowed down to just a few dozen that matched the light blue description provided by witnesses, CMPD continued cross-referencing timing, the owner's residential locations, and travel habits, to reduce the number needing checks. Vehicle owners living too far from Freedom Park or with evidence that their cars had not left the garage on the day Henry went missing were eliminated first. What remained was a small group of individuals with vehicles matching the description and who could plausibly have been at the park that afternoon. From this group, 3 names stood out due to the overlap of residence, schedule and level of suspicion: Harold Benton, Eddie Collins, and Raymond Cooper. Benton was placed on the list first because he lived just over a mile from Freedom Park and had a daily route that passed through the park. The exact time frame Henry disappeared, Collins appeared on the list not only for owning a light blue Bel Air, but also because of a prior criminal record involving minors, making him automatically a person of interest in any case involving children. Cooper became the 3rd suspect when cross-checking DMV data revealed that his claim of having sold the car lacked valid paperwork, and the timing of that declaration unusually coincided with Henry's disappearance. After identifying the three priority subjects, CMPD created a comparison chart to assess each person's connection to the Freedom Park area. Benton had a history of driving past the park every afternoon, making him fit the description of the car leaving the side gate. Collins lived near the Dilworth area, close enough to reach without a specific reason, while Cooper lived farther away but had a work route that could quickly connect to the park via a main road. Investigators marked each of these factors to determine how plausible it would be for one of them to have been at the park that afternoon. This location connection analysis played a particularly important role, because at this point in the investigation, there was no clear physical evidence beyond witness statements about the Bel Air. Following the location assessment, CMPD began preparing the next step, gathering deeper information, and verifying each suspect's schedule on the day Henry went missing. This included scheduling interviews with each person, checking receipts, workplaces, store logs, and linearously contacting individuals who could confirm or deny their presence during the critical time frame. For Bent, investigators gathered information from the auto shop owner, where he claimed to have gone that afternoon. For Collins, they needed to verify his work schedule and witnesses at the place where he said he was repairing a house for an acquaintance. And for Cooper, they needed to re-examine all paperwork related to the Bel Air, including registration, sales documents, and any unusual address changes around the time Henry disappeared. All of this data was prepared to build the most complete suspect profiles possible before moving to the direct confrontation phase, because every detail in the timeline, even a few minutes discrepancy, could become the key factor helping CMPD narrow or expand the scope of suspicion, and more importantly, determine which of the three men owned the light blue Bel Air seen at Freedom Park that day, now the focal point of the investigation. Identifying the first three subjects from the group of light blue Bel Air owners led CMPD to the critical next step, checking each person's alibi to assess their potential involvement at the time Henry disappeared, and Benton was examined first due to his residence near Freedom Park and regular route through the area. According to his statement, Benton said he stopped at an auto shop to pick up parts that afternoon. Investigators went directly to the shop to check invoices, transaction logs, and interview the owner. The results showed Benton was indeed there that day, but the time between leaving home and signing for the parts differed by nearly 40 minutes, a gap that overlapped with the window CMPD could not reconstruct in the Freedom Park timeline. Although there was no direct evidence showing Benton drove into the park, the time discrepancy meant he could not be removed from the suspect list. The second suspect, Eddie Collins, carried a factor that forced police to scrutinize him more closely: a prior conviction involving minors from years earlier, making him not just an owner of a matching vehicle, but a person with a history requiring review. Collins stated he spent the entire afternoon repairing a roof for an acquaintance in the Matthews area, and when investigators verified, 3 independent witnesses confirmed Collins's presence for several hours, giving his alibi higher credibility than the other 2 suspects. However, because of Collins's prior record, CMPD still thoroughly checked every detail: travel records, vehicle, coincidences regarding the Bel Air, but no data placed him near Freedom Park during the critical period. The temporary conclusion was that Collins was unlikely to be involved, but he could not be fully ruled out until all time points were cross-checked. Raymond Cooper III proved to be the case that complicated the file further when his Bel Air data showed multiple inconsistencies. Cooper claimed he sold the car a few weeks before the disappearance, but there was no valid transfer paperwork, and the DMV had no record confirming a change of ownership. Moreover, Cooper could not provide witnesses confirming where he was the afternoon Henry went missing, only vaguely saying he was at home organizing things, leaving his alibi nearly empty. Investigators checked neighbors near Cooper's home, but no one clearly remembered whether he was there that day. At the same time, the lack of transparency in Cooper's Bel Air history made him the highest-risk suspect of the 3. When cross-referencing all 3 alibis against the disappearance timeline, the period from 4:17 to around 4:25 that CMPD determined as the phase when Henry was let out of the observation area, no one of the 3 could be considered completely innocent. Benton had an unverified travel window. Collins had a clear timeline but remained on the list due to his record, while Cooper had no alibi evidence at all, and contradictory vehicle information. This left the investigation in a difficult state. All three had suspicious elements, but none had evidence strong enough to charge. Meanwhile, no witness could clearly identify the driver of the Bel Air at Freedom Park, and no physical evidence recovered in the first 24 hours could directly link a suspect to the scene. The result of the alibi-checking phase showed CMPD could not clearly identify the perpetrator based on current data, and the case had to continue with expanded investigation, re-evaluating community tips, and seeking new leads that might narrow the suspect pool, since none of the three men fully met the criteria for complete elimination or charging. The inability to clearly identify the perpetrator from the first three suspects forced CMPD to broaden the scope of community information intake, and just days after publicizing Henry's description along with the report of the light blue Bel Air, tips began pouring in at an accelerating rate, requiring the coordination unit to classify them continuously. One of the most notable reports came from the route heading toward South Carolina, where a driver said he saw a child crying and screaming in a light-colored car heading south. An investigative team was immediately dispatched to the described area, sweeping along the route, stopping at gas stations in small residential areas for additional witnesses, but no one could confirm a vehicle or child matching Henry. The area was vast, traffic density high, and the delay between the driver's report and investigators' arrival made tracing nearly impossible, turning this report into a lead with no practical value. Alongside the crying child tip, CMPD found a small piece of evidence during the expanded sweep around trails at Freedom Park, a blonde hair strand caught on a bush. The evidence was collected under standard procedure, marked and sent to the lab, but 1960 technology did not allow DNA analysis or specific biological identification, leaving the item classified as undeterminable and stored in the file. The existence of this evidence gave the family a very small hope, but CMPD knew it could not be relied upon to guide the investigation since the area had been heavily trampled by searchers in the initial effort. The situation grew more complicated with a flood of false reports. Residents in various neighborhoods claimed to have seen Henry at supermarkets, parks, parking lots, and some even said they saw him with a man in a blue shirt. But when investigators followed up, most turned out to be mistaken identifications since Henry's description resembled many other boys his age. Some reports were even considered deliberately disruptive when callers provided conflicting information or repeatedly changed their story. The peak of the misinformation wave was an anonymous letter sent to CMPD stating the child is being hidden in the north part of the city, and the perpetrator will contact again with another letter. The handwriting was unclear, the content vague, containing no insider details, only the real perpetrator would know, leading police to quickly determine the letter was unreliable. However, since no possibility could be ignored, CMPD had to allocate resources to analyze the letter, compare handwriting, check fingerprints, and trace the mailing location. But the final result was still nothing. Meanwhile, Charlotte media entered a phase of intense coverage, each outlet with a different tone. Some helped spread search information, but many stories inadvertently amplified unverified theories, causing public panic and placing heavy pressure on CM. Rumors spread quickly that the Bel Air had been seen in multiple places around the city, even though most information came from the same witness repeatedly quoted by the press. One newspaper even suggested Henry might have left the park on his own and misled his family, leading to unfounded speculation and further hurting the Murphy family. The media amplification caused the hotline to be flooded with false reports, creating an enormous workload for the coordination team and diluting potentially valuable tips. When CMPD compiled all the new information, a temporary conclusion was reached. None of these leads actually brought them closer to identifying the perpetrator or narrowing Henry's possible route. The crying child report lacked supporting evidence. The physical evidence could not be analyzed. The anonymous letter was useless. Community reports were vague, and media information mostly created distortion rather than providing investigative data. The case, instead of advancing, became heavier due to the overlap of false leads and the unfillable gaps in the overall picture of the afternoon Henry vanished from Freedom Park. The relentless influx of false reports and unverifiable leads further convinced the CMPD that the scope of the investigation could not be confined within Charlotte's boundaries, especially since the light blue Bel Air likely left Freedom Park just minutes after Henry's disappearance, forcing the investigative team to shift toward expanding federal cooperation with neighboring states South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia areas with major highways directly connected to Charlotte, facilitating any perpetrator's rapid escape from the city by motor vehicle. Assistance requests were sent to the police departments of the 3 states, including descriptions of Henry, the vehicle, and the time of disappearance, while also requesting reviews of all gas stations, roadside stores, rest stops, and reports of unidentified children within 72 hours of the incident. Upon receiving the requests, the states began cross-referencing records of missing or found wandering children in their areas, but most did not match Henry due to differences in age, hair color, and investigation timing. However, some reports from SC and TN noted sightings of a blond boy at roadside stores, along highways, which the CMPD could not ignore despite the low probability. These reports compelled investigative teams to travel and verify each case, including one in Greenville, South Carolina, where a resident claimed to have seen a boy being pulled into a car by a middle-aged man. When investigators arrived, they discovered it was simply a local family putting their child in the car after he had been crying, completely unrelated to Henry. Another case in Chattanooga, Tennessee, reported a child wandering near a rest stop, but when Tennessee police verified it, the boy belonged to a family traveling cross-country and had only been separated from his mother for a few minutes. The coincidence made the lead a waste of time and resources. Similar cases emerged in Georgia, either temporarily lost children or mere confusions based on the generic description blonde about 5 years old, which was very common in the southeastern states at the time. The constant confusion in these reports not only cost the investigative team dozens of hours traveling between states, but also diverted the investigation, making it difficult to focus on truly significant data. With each pursuit of a false lead, the CMPD noted that although the community was well-intentioned in offering support, tips based on vague memories or public speculation often created more obstacles than progress. As the CMPD compiled federal data at the end of the expansion phase, a clear pattern began to emerge. Despite numerous reports of blonde about 5 years old children, there was no physical evidence, images, or consistent testimony indicating Henry had walked far from Freedom Park, let alone left Charlotte on his own. On the contrary, the continual tips appearing along major highways reinforced the hypothesis that the child had been taken by vehicle immediately after being approached. The fact that no one saw Henry walking, no personal items were left beyond the trail area, and the timing of the Bel Air leaving the park perfectly matched the moment of his disappearance, led to the investigative unit's initial conclusion. The perpetrator was not acting impulsively, but was someone with a plan, utilizing a motor vehicle to escape the area before anyone could react. This opened a new direction of analysis for the CMPD, that the man who approached Henry may have been stalking him beforehand, familiar with the park's layout, and knowing exactly the right moment to take him away from Charlotte, undetected, and this became the foundation for the next step in investigation as the case increasingly leaned toward the possibility that the child had been taken far from the city on the very first day. The efforts to expand the federal investigation yielded no specific traces of Henry, forcing the CMPD to confront the reality that after weeks of mobilizing forces across the region, the case had made no further progress, and in the summary evaluation meeting for the investigative phase, senior commanders concluded that the existing leads were insufficient to continue maintaining an active investigation. Every avenue led to a dead end, with no new witnesses, no analyzable physical evidence, no identified vehicle, and no suspects with alibis strong enough to be cleared or weak enough to be charged. Under the constraints of reallocating personnel to other violent crimes and disappearances in the city, the CMPD was compelled to transfer Henry Murphy's file to inactive status, meaning the investigation would be suspended until new evidence or information capable of altering the case emerged. This decision was not merely administrative, but marked a significant turning point. All documents, scene reports, witness statements, suspect lists, park diagrams, false tips, anonymous letters, and collected evidence were compiled and packaged into a final investigative report to be sent to the State Archive Center in Raleigh. There the file would be preserved long-term under procedures for unsolved disappearances with its own identification code, officially designating the Henry Murphy case as a cold case in North Carolina's legal system. For Samuel Ross, the lead investigator from the first tells, the file's transfer to inactive status meant he lost direct access and was no longer assigned hours to continue following it. Ross had included many personal notes in the report, particularly his suspicions about Cooper and the irreconstructible points in the critical 8-minute timeline, but lacking legal basis. All these notes had to remain dormant in the archived file. Ross continued to believe that some missing piece had yet to be found, but he no longer had authority to investigate further without new directives, turning his sense of helplessness into a lingering regret throughout his career. Meanwhile, the Murphy family faced the heaviest impact from the decision to suspend the investigation. Eleanor fell into a state of near exhaustion, unable to accept that Henry's name was being added to the cold case list, a term that to her meant hope was fading away. Thomas tried to return to work but kept coming back to Freedom Park out of desperate habit, hoping to find even a small clue the police had missed. The family felt abandoned as the legal process needed to move forward, but parents' hearts could not comply with the coldness of procedure. The atmosphere in Charlotte also changed. Initially, Henry's case shocked the community, but as the media ran out of new information and authorities stopped updates, the case gradually faded from public memory. That silence made the family feel even more acutely the isolation that those with missing loved ones often endure, a pain without closure, without explanation, and without answers. When Henry's file was transferred to the Raleigh archive, the case was closed on paper, but left behind a series of unanswered questions. Who took Henry, where Henry was, what happened in those brief 8 minutes at Freedom Park, and which rumor had buried the real clue? No one could answer those questions in 1960, and there was no way to find new data now. From here, the disappearance of Henry Murphy sank into years of silence, an unsolved case, awaiting something powerful enough to bring it back into the light. The file on Henry being placed in inactive status also marked the moment the boy began his new life, under the name Daniel Cooper, an identity created by Raymond without any official documents to confirm it, meaning all activities related to Daniel's medical care and education relied on explanations or manual records that were hard to verify. Medical visits for Daniel only occurred at small clinics that did not require birth certificates, while schooling was delayed by Raymond through homeschooling, a reason sufficient to avoid submitting enrollment records or contacting local authorities. Daniel grew up in a completely controlled environment where Raymond dictated daily schedules, the extent of allowed outings, and minimized contact with neighbors or strangers, especially as Daniel reached school age and began asking more questions about the world around him. Raymond's answers were always vague and consistent in portraying the outside world as unsafe and that Daniel needed to avoid crowds, resulting in the boy experiencing a childhood almost entirely isolated from the community. Neighbors near Raymond's home at the time recalled that Daniel was rarely seen playing in the yard or running around like other children, and when he did appear, he would often just stand near the door or porch with a cautious demeanor as if waiting for permission from Raymond before doing anything. This shyness was initially seen by those around them as a personality trait, but it actually reflected the level of control Raymond imposed on Daniel throughout his early years. In daily activities, Raymond always decided when Daniel could leave the house, which routes to take, and whom to interact with, preventing Daniel from forming basic social networks like age-appropriate friends, teachers, or familiar neighbors. This lack of contact also made it difficult for anyone outside the household to suspect the boy's true circumstances or notice irregularities in non-existent paperwork. However, this restricted environment itself created certain events and behaviors that later, when re-examined during investigations, became important pieces showing Daniel was not Raymond's biological child. One of the most noticeable manifestations was Daniel's strong reactions to train sounds, despite Raymond never explaining any prior related experiences. The sound of passing trains seemed to trigger something that made Daniel pay unusual attention, sometimes stopping all activity to listen, and this repeated over many years, becoming a prominent behavioral characteristic. Additionally, fragmented memories that Daniel could not explain, such as images of a park with a lake, distant children's laughter, or the sensation of holding someone's hand before slipping away, appeared sporadically as he grew up, but lacking context to understand them. He viewed them merely as scattered dreams. The clinics where Raymond took Daniel sometimes requested vaccination records or birthplace information. Each time Raymond would switch facilities or cite frequent moves to avoid providing a birth certificate. This raised no suspicion at the time, but later became minor evidence, proving Daniel had no real identity. By the late 1960s, Daniel still lived in isolation, without attending school, without official medical records, and almost entirely dependent on Raymond deciding what he knew, where he went, and whom he met. These details, when pieced together chronologically, clearly reflected a years-long process to prevent Daniel from interacting with systems that could detect his lack of paperwork, and though no one noticed then, these very gaps later became the foundation for re-establishing Henry Murphy's identity decades afterward. Daniel's life in the 1960s was tied to the series of moves that Raymond decided on, and this chain of relocations later became an important part of the tracing process. Starting in Knoxville, where Raymond settled in the early years after the incident in Charlotte, this area was a mix of working-class residents and manual laborers, allowing Raymond to blend into the community without scrutiny over documents or family records. After a few years living there, Raymond moved Daniel to Chattanooga, citing a job change, and notably, the two left no school transfer records or any official notices. They simply disappeared from the old address and appeared at the new one, where they rented a small room in a low-income housing area. Rental records collected many years later show that Raymond typically signed short-term leases from 3 to 6 months, and when they expired, he would leave without providing a forwarding address. This pattern of rentals stretched across various areas of Tennessee, and because identity verification processes were lax at the time, landlords generally only required a deposit without deeply checking identities. For employment, Raymond often chose seasonal labor jobs like minor repairs, loading and unloading, or technical assistance at private workshops where complete records were not required and information was not retained long-term. This made tracing his work history years later difficult, but scattered pieces of information obtained show that he often quit suddenly without notice and rarely used the same name in 2 different places. Discrepancies in Raymond's paperwork became clearer when archived records were cross-checked, particularly labor declarations or rental contracts, with inconsistent signatures, sometimes using the surname Cooper, sometimes abbreviations or variants that did not fully match, and in a few rare cases, even using addresses that did not exist in reality. These details indicate that he intentionally avoided leaving a continuous trail while maintaining a chain of identities loose enough to avoid cross-verification. When aligning Raymond's timeline of moves with the time of Henry's disappearance, investigators noted several notable coincidences. His appearance in Knoxville coincided with the period when Henry vanished from the system. The move to Chattanooga occurred as Daniel reached an age requiring documents for medical services, and the departure from Chattanooga to Nashville aligned with Daniel's first attempts to question his identity. These overlaps could not prove criminal behavior, but created a logical chain, showing that Raymond moved whenever there was a risk of local authorities requiring official records. When compiling the locations where Raymond had resided to create a map for re-examination, certain sites were highlighted as potential areas for thorough searches due to their direct connection to Daniel's journey. The first rented room in Knoxville, where Daniel was taken shortly after his disappearance, the apartment complex in Chattanooga, with multiple tenants around the time of their arrival, and a suburban address in Nashville where Raymond stayed longer than usual, likely the place where he felt safest maintaining his false identity. Each of these locations held the potential for physical evidence, old witnesses, or archived records, that could later help reconstruct Raymond's entire route in the first decade after taking Henry from Charlotte. The constant moves throughout the 1960s not only caused Daniel to grow up in an isolated environment, but also created a significant gap in his social integration. And the first turning point that shook the structure Raymond had maintained for years came when Daniel reached the age to apply for a driver's license. The mandatory requirement to provide a social security number put him in a situation where he could not complete the application, as all the information Raymond had given him did not match any data in the system. And when the clerk at the registration center told him that the number he provided did not exist, Daniel had to leave without understanding why his personal documents were different from everyone else's. This incident sparked a vagueness in Daniel that he had never faced as a child, and doubt began to grow as he realized that questions about his birth date, place of birth, or hospital name only received evasive answers from Raymond. The suspicion continued to build when Daniel accidentally discovered an item that did not belong to their current life, an old birthday card with the name Henry written in childish scrawl, tucked away in the bottom drawer of a cabinet that Raymond rarely allowed anyone to touch. Daniel did not know who Henry was, why the card existed, or why it was carefully stored instead of discarded like other old items, but its presence evoked an unexplained sense of familiarity. When Daniel asked Raymond about it, the response was evasive as always, and that very ambiguity began to fracture their relationship. Raymond's already strict control intensified as he minimized Daniel's time outside the home, monitored his activities more closely, and tried to deflect any questions about the past. Daniel increasingly felt that the gap between what he had been taught and what he observed in real life no longer aligned. Peers his age had identification documents, could take part-time jobs, apply for driver's licenses, or register for classes, while he had no documents at all and could not explain the reason to anyone. The inconsistencies in Raymond's words, combined with the fragmented memories that Daniel occasionally experienced, led him to seriously question his true identity, whether Daniel Cooper was really his name, or if he was simply living in a story fabricated by the man he still called father. The frustration grew each time Daniel tried to seek answers, but was blocked with advice like "don't ask unnecessary questions," or "everything has already been arranged," and this accumulated tension laid the groundwork for Daniel to realize that if he continued living in the current environment, he would never learn the truth about himself. When the family conflicts reached a level Daniel could no longer tolerate, the decision to leave Tennessee began to form, driven by the desire to seek answers outside Raymond's control, opening the next phase in Henry's life that Raymond could no longer prevent. The lingering tension and questions about his identity led Daniel to decide to leave Tennessee, choosing to depart while Raymond was away to avoid direct confrontation, and taking only a few changes of clothes along with the small amount of money he had saved. He headed to Atlanta, a larger city where Daniel believed he could find opportunities to start over and simultaneously seek answers to the questions evaded for years. However, the lack of valid documents quickly became a major obstacle when Daniel began looking for work, as most employers required identification, ID cards, or a social security number that he could not provide, resulting in him only being able to take low-paying day labor or shift jobs at parking lots, warehouses, and small repair shops. Each workplace posed minimal questions about his background that Daniel found increasingly hard to dodge, causing him to frequently change jobs to avoid drawing too much attention. During one prolonged injury after a heavy shift, Daniel was forced to visit a community clinic for a checkup, where registration required basic information that he lacked. The medical staff, instead of refusing service, asked him to participate in a pathology research program funded by a local university, where patients did not need full documentation but had to consent to biological samples like blood or saliva being stored as research data. Daniel agreed because he had no other choice, and in that visit, he provided the first DNA sample of his life, without knowing it would become the most critical link to his stolen past. Daniel's DNA sample was stored in the biomedical research database, used by the program for general genetic analysis, and although not tied to a specific legal identity, the record still existed as biological data that could be matched when needed. After that visit, Daniel tried to investigate his identity through the fragmented methods he could think of, asking his boarding house landlord about document application processes, going to the library to research how to obtain a birth certificate copy, watching others fill out forms to identify what he was missing, but every effort led back to the same deadlock. Daniel had no foundational information to start with, not even knowing his exact real birth date. He tried to recall fragmented memories, but they provided no specific answers. The feeling of not belonging here only intensified with each month in Atlanta. The isolation from documents, employment and personal information made Daniel realize that to understand him, he needed something greater than vague memories or Raymond's inconsistent words, and though he did not know how it would come, he continued to exist in a state half searching, half avoiding, waiting for a change he could not foresee. The biological data Daniel left behind in the research program in Atlanta remained quietly in storage for many years without being linked to any legal identity until North Carolina launched a project to collect and digitize DNA samples from relatives of long-term missing persons for entry into the CODIS system, in which Eleanor Murphy agreed to provide her DNA sample because she wanted to exhaust every possibility, even though hope had nearly faded after more than 3 decades. The project required analyzing family member DNA to search for any matches in biomedical databases or nationwide collections of unidentified samples, and Eleanor's data was processed, encoded, and entered into the system's periodic scan flow. When CODIS performed automatic comparisons across millions of records, Daniel's DNA sample, which had been stored in a research data set rather than a legal profile, unexpectedly became one of the samples identified by CODIS, thanks to the mechanism integrating research data for the purpose of identifying potential victims. The system detected a very high similarity rate between this sample and Eleanor, sufficient to generate an alert for potential DNA match with missing person, signaling the need for further verification. This result was forwarded to CMPD through the state's cold case processing unit, where investigators reviewed each alert to determine whether to initiate an investigation. The alert related to Henry Murphy received special attention due to the very high match level, and because Henry's file had been on the list of unresolved child missing cases which was always prioritized for review in the event of any unusual developments. When the alert file was transferred to the CMPD cold case unit, investigators immediately pulled all of Henry's old documents from storage in Raleigh for re-examination, reviewing everything from the initial scene report, witness statements, suspect list, to physical particles and evidence that was difficult to analyze at the time. Finding a family DNA match after many decades prompted the command to require activation of the cold case reopening procedure, including verifying the sample source, tracing the location of the individual with the matching DNA, and assessing the possibility that Henry was still alive. The DNA analysis records from the lab were reviewed multiple times to rule out technical errors, then confirmed that the unidentified sample from Atlanta had a very high probability of belonging to Eleanor's biological son, and this immediately elevated the case to priority status, even though there was no information yet about the current name or residence of the person carrying that DNA sample. The CMPD cold case prepared an internal report for escalation, requesting relevant units to begin identifying the origin of the Atlanta hospital DNA sample, including incomplete patient records, data entry timing, and any additional information that could help identify the sample owner. This process revealed that the sample belonged to a patient who had been seen many years earlier, without clear legal identity, fully matching the description Daniel had provided at the clinic. Obtaining a DNA sample created an unprecedented opportunity in the Henry Murphy case, because after more than 30 years, this was the first time CMPD had a strong enough physical indicator to prove Henry might still exist in the real world. Investigators quickly placed the Henry case in the high priority group, based on 2 factors: the direct DNA linkage potential, and the possibility of determining the victim's current status in the near term. The cold case unit command required developing a 3-step investigation plan determining the current identity of the DNA, determining the current geographic location of that person, and cross-referencing with the entire 1960 case timeline to assess compatibility. This required CMPD to coordinate with the medical facility where the DNA sample was collected to trace back patient records through research code, visit dates, and accompanying administrative data despite being very limited. Upon reviewing the hospital record, investigators noted that the DNA sample was linked to a patient named Daniel Cooper, the name Daniel habitually provided but without documents to prove it, and the emptiness in this person's legal records immediately became an abnormal sign, matching the assumption of a missing child grown up without real identity. Discovering the name Daniel Cooper was not enough to confirm Henry's identity, but sufficient for CMPD to move the case to the next action group with clear priority, locating the person carrying the DNA match with Eleanor by all possible methods to verify identity, collect additional biological information, and cross-reference with the night. The appearance of the CODIS alert not only pulled the Henry case out of its long-frozen state, but also created a foundation for CMPD to reassess the entire previous investigation structure, identify weaknesses in the old file, and prepare to enter the re-evaluation phase with the goal of determining whether the person with the matching DNA was indeed Henry Murphy, and if so, how the boy missing from Freedom Park in 1960 reappeared in Atlanta medical data more than 3 decades later. The information from the CODIS alert, placing the DNA match with Eleanor under verification, forced the CMPD cold case unit to immediately re-examine the entire original file, and Detective Laura Kendrick, an investigator experienced in handling long-term missing persons cases, was assigned to review all of Samuel Ross's reports from 1960. Kendrick began by rereading every section of the original report, including scene notes, Freedom Park diagrams, witness statements, Bel Air vehicle pursuit records, and the list of 3 screened suspects, to determine what in the old file could connect to the new DNA results, or support identifying the man named Daniel Cooper in the Atlanta hospital records. During the review, Kendrick paid special attention to the time gap from 4:17 to 4:25, the moment Henry disappeared from sight and the Bel Air was reported leaving the park, because this was the only timeline segment that perfectly fit the hypothesis of Henry being taken into the car in a short time, and it was the point Ross had marked as unable to reconstruct due to lack of direct witnesses. When cross-referencing this timeline with the current DNA data, Kendrick considered the possibility that Henry was indeed taken from Freedom Park in the Bel Air, and if the man driving that car was Cooper, then the 1960 timeline had to match the movement history that Cooper and Daniel left in the Tennessee records. The next section Kendrick focused on was reanalyzing the 3 initial suspects, Benton, Collins, and Cooper, based on new criteria, in which DNA played a key role in assessing each person's relevance. Benton had a relatively solid alibi and no overlap with the locations where Daniel appeared in Atlanta. Collins had a criminal record but a complete alibi on the day of the disappearance, and no movement history matching Daniel's timeline years later. Both, according to Kendrick, lacked the ability to maintain a long-term identity control structure over decades, while the appearance of a man named Cooper in the Atlanta hospital records, without full documents and directly linked to the DNA match with Eleanor, made Raymond Cooper the only subject still fitting both new and old data. Kendrick reopened the part of Ross's report noting that Cooper had inconsistent statements about selling the Bel Air, and no evidence confirming the car was no longer in his possession on the day Henry disappeared, a point that was insufficient for charges at the time, but took on different importance when considered in the DNA context. The report also stated Cooper had no witnesses confirming his location that afternoon, making him stand out more than the other 2 suspects. The investigator cross-referenced Cooper's movement history based on Tennessee documents, rental records, signature discrepancy, and moving times, with the timeline from Ross's report, and found the sequence Knoxville, Chattanooga, Nashville matched the period when Henry under the name Daniel grew up, without official document, reinforcing the hypothesis that Cooper took Henry from Charlotte on the day of the disappearance, and kept him under control for many years. Kendrick marked the matching points between the 2 files, by period the appearance of a 5-year-old child in Knoxville shortly after Henry's disappearance, moving whenever the child reached an age requiring documents, and the disappearance of Bel Air information from the DMV system in the same period. From these signs, Kendrick built a new approach focused entirely on Raymond Cooper, in which tracing his last known address, referencing sporadic employment records, reviewing old identification records, and identifying the man named Daniel Cooper in the Atlanta hospital records, became priority steps. Upon completing the review process, Kendrick reported that of the 3 initial suspects, only Cooper fully met the factors: no solid alibi, suitable described vehicle, movement history matching Daniel's appearance, and most importantly indirect linkage to the DNA match with Eleanor. This was the foundation for determining the investigation direction needed to continue along a clear path to clarify the connection between Cooper and the newly discovered DNA sample, opening the phase of direct approach to the subject and verifying whether the person with the matching DNA was indeed Henry Murphy missing. The new investigation direction focused on Cooper required the CMPD cold case unit to simultaneously verify the identity of the person carrying the DNA match with Eleanor, and the first step in this process was cross-referencing the remaining biological data from the 1960 Henry file with what could be obtained from the Atlanta hospital. The old file still retained child fingerprints taken at the hospital when Henry was born and a basic dental record noted when he was 4 years old, data that seemed only archival but now became crucial for determining whether Daniel Cooper truly matched Henry. When requesting the Atlanta clinic to provide information related to patient Daniel Cooper, CMPD received a minimal file with fingerprints taken during a minor injury requiring bandaging, along with dental images for general examination purposes in the research program. This data was entered into the state's comparison system to cross-reference with Henry's fingerprints and dental records, and the analysis results showed a match level high enough to rule out random coincidence, sufficient to determine Daniel and Henry were the same person under legal criteria. This verification relied not only on DNA or fingerprints, but also combined additional identification factors, such as mouth characteristics, slightly misaligned jaw development noted when Henry was young, and these details appeared matching in Daniel's dental images years later. Once the biological cross-referencing process was confirmed, Kendrick moved to collecting Daniel's life information to further strengthen the identity file, including residences, daily habits, employment history, and any details related to the past that Daniel had shared with colleagues or landlords. Some people remembered that Daniel rarely talked about family, never mentioned biological parents, and always avoided questions about childhood, while others recounted Daniel occasionally expressing vague memories not matching life in Tennessee, such as images of a park, lake, or train sounds near home, all matching the Charlotte context where Henry lived before disappearing. These life details were not legal in nature but formed supporting puzzle pieces, further reinforcing the investigation conclusion that the person known as Daniel Cooper was actually Henry Murphy, the child who vanished from Freedom Park in. When the legal, biological, and behavioral data all converged on a common point, the cold case unit completed the report confirming Henry Murphy under the state's victim identification standards, marking the breaking of more than 3 decades of silence in the missing person case. With this conclusion, CMPD had to prepare the next step, approaching Henry not only as a found person, but also as a key witness to clarify the chain of events starting from that afternoon in 1960, and to prepare for this approach, Kendrick gathered all necessary files, developed an interview plan, and assessed psychological factors to ensure the meeting with Henry followed proper investigation procedures, while respecting the sensitive context of someone who had lived their entire life under an identity not their own. The verification that Daniel was indeed Henry forced Kendrick to shift focus to the individual directly responsible for Henry's disappearance, and Raymond Cooper was the only person in the old files who still matched all the data points. The next step was to coordinate with Nashville PD to track down his current whereabouts, starting with reviewing all addresses Cooper had used during his Tennessee period and cross-referencing them with any remaining records in the city's system. Nashville PD provided a list of addresses where Cooper had resided, including a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts, a short-term rental in a low-income working-class area, and a former temporary workplace that Cooper had left without notice. Kendrick requested cross-checks of all retained rental records, reviews of old resident registration logs, and employee lists at the machine shops where Cooper had worked, while also seeking out individuals who might have interacted with him to verify whether they had seen any signs of children living with Cooper in the past. Interview results showed that Cooper rarely shared personal details and always limited contact, consistent with the behavior of controlling Henry years earlier. Investigators continued examining Nashville's administrative data, uncovering an address near an industrial area where Cooper had signed a seasonal labor contract before abruptly leaving, and following this lead, Kendrick identified documents such as utility bills, rent payment records, and signed delivery receipts, bearing handwriting matching Cooper's signature in the Charlotte files, further strengthening the chain of his residence. Several witnesses at the apartment complex recalled seeing Cooper during the period corresponding to Daniel's time in Tennessee, and they described him as frequently leaving early, returning late, rarely communicating, and sometimes appearing guarded when asked about his private life. These pieces of information allowed Kendrick to reconstruct Cooper's final movements, thereby determining that he had left the old rental and moved to another part of Nashville, where tax records and utility bills showed activities still under his name. With this data, Kendrick coordinated with Nashville PD to compile a list of locations for immediate checks, conducting surveillance of the areas and gathering documents to confirm Cooper's current presence. Nashville PD officers divided up observation of sites matching valid administrative information, including a small house behind a repair shop, where utility records indicated recent electricity consumption. When the surveillance team confirmed Cooper was leaving and returning on a stable work schedule, Kendrick ordered the execution of an arrest warrant under state regulations based on evidence related to removing Henry from Charlotte and maintaining a false identity for many years. Nashville PD coordinated the approach to the house at the time Cooper returned, securing the surrounding area and applying standard arrest procedure. Cooper was taken into custody without resistance, and his entire residence was sealed for evidence collection, including mismatched identity documents, old items suspected of relating to Henry as a child, and materials that could help reconstruct his journey from Cooper's arrest opened the first opportunity in over 3 decades to hear directly from the man believed to have taken Henry from Freedom Park, and Kendrick, along with investigators, conducted the interrogation according to procedure to obtain Cooper's version of the truth. In the initial session, Cooper presented a story heavy with justifications, claiming that he was only trying to help a child in an unsafe situation, that Henry was not cared for by his family, and that he took the boy out of concern for the child's safety. But this statement immediately raised doubts because there was no evidence in the 1960 records indicating Henry was abused or at risk in his family. Kendrick cross-referenced every detail of Cooper's statement against the starting from the disappearance at Freedom Park. Cooper claimed he was only coincidentally at the park that day, but records of the light-colored Bel Air never transferred ownership at the time he claimed showed the car still belonged to him on the day Henry vanished. Cooper also could not explain why he did not report the child protection to authorities, instead taking Henry to Knoxville, living reclusively for years, not enrolling him in school, not registering for medical care, and always keeping him out of community sight. The biggest contradictions emerged when Cooper described the early years raising Henry. He said the boy did not want contact with strangers, was afraid of crowds, and had health issues making school difficult, but dental records and daily life patterns of Henry in Tennessee showed no such conditions, instead indicating he was only restricted by Cooper's control. Kendrick noted these inconsistencies and combined them with data gathered from rental records, utility bills, and witness statements to build a complete criminal timeline. Cooper appeared at Freedom Park on the afternoon Henry vanished, observed Henry and Caleb from a distance, approached the boy while the parents were distracted, removed Henry from the park in an 8-minute window without witnesses, left Charlotte via a southern or northwestern route, depending on his chosen path, and arrived in Knoxville within a time frame matching the appearance of Daniel Cooper in Tennessee. Cooper's frequent moves in subsequent years clarified the behavioral pattern. Each time Henry reached an age requiring legal documentation, Cooper would leave, and the actions to avoid leaving traces were consistent with someone aware they were holding a child not their own. When cross-referencing the statement with DNA data, Kendrick determined that Cooper's explanations were logically unconvincing, because if Henry had truly been helped, Cooper had dozens of opportunities to report to authorities during medical encounters or moves, but he did not. Instead, he actively created a new identity for Henry, indicating intent, not of protection but of long-term control. The largest unexplained point in Cooper's statement was the motive. He provided no specific reason for taking Henry, only vague claims inconsistent with actual behavior. Any questions about why he was at Freedom Park were evaded by Cooper or answered by blaming an unexpected situation, which did not align with the behavioral pattern reconstructed from years of movement record. When synthesizing the entire statement, physical evidence, DNA samples, movement records, and witnesses, the CMPD Cold Case Unit concluded that Cooper's level of responsibility in the 1960 disappearance far exceeded accidentally encountering a child, but was intentional conduct exploiting the moment of parental distraction to approach Henry, then maintaining his isolation from society for decades. This conclusion was based not only on DNA evidence and contradictory statements, but also on Cooper's continuous efforts to ensure no one discovered Henry, clearly demonstrating intent to conceal the boy's true identity. For the conclusion regarding Cooper's responsibility and the confirmation that Daniel was Henry Murphy required CMPD to take an equally important step, informing the Murphy family that the case thought to have gone silent for 3 decades had real progress. The notification was delivered directly to Eleanor and Thomas, according to protocol for long-term missing persons cases, with the presence of cold case unit representatives and a psychological support specialist to ensure the family received the information safely. After confirming the family had processed the news, CMPD focused on finalizing the ultimate identification file to ensure all information used in the reunion was absolutely accurate. This file included biological data, DNA, fingerprints, soft identification factors, such as physical characteristics and daily habits gathered from old witnesses, along with Daniel's life data from Tennessee and Atlanta, all compiled into a unified dossier to prevent any discrepancies when approaching Henry. Once the file was complete, Kendrick coordinated with CMPD to plan the schedule for the meeting between Henry and his family, with clear requirements for privacy, safety and media control. The meeting could not happen abruptly but had to be carefully prepared, including assessing Henry's psychological state after receiving information about his true identity, determining a suitable location to avoid pressure on both sides, and ensuring every step respected the victim's recovery process. To prepare Henry for facing the truth hidden for CMPD contacted psychological counselors experienced in supporting adults who were childhood abduction victims, while also arranging legal support to help Henry understand post-reunion procedures, particularly restoring legal identity and updating personal records in administrative systems. Additionally, CMPD had to develop a media plan to protect Henry and the family from excessive press attention, as the story of a missing child found after more than 3 decades would certainly have major community impact. The media strategy was established to release information in stages, only after the family had met Henry and confirmed stability, while requiring media outlets to comply with victim privacy regulations. After all legal, psychological and administrative elements were prepared, Kendrick submitted to command the plan for approaching Henry, including timing of the meeting, sequence of information exchange, method of introducing the family, and contingency support if Henry's psychological reaction went beyond expectations. The entire plan was approved after ensuring this would be a reunion conducted under the safest possible conditions, marking the transition from the investigation phase to the victim's identity recovery phase. Once all legal procedures, psychological support, and approach plans were completed, CMPD arranged a face-to-face meeting between Henry and the Murphy family in a private room coordinated by the Psychological Counseling Unit, where there was no media presence and no tense police oversight, in order to create the safest possible environment for both sides. Henry entered the room with the characteristic caution of someone who had lived for many years in a state of distrust toward information about himself, while Eleanor and Thomas sat opposite, holding hands to stay calm after being informed that their missing child was standing right on the other side of the door. In the moment Henry saw them, none of the 3 could speak immediately, as the emotions surged so strongly that all movement seemed to freeze. Henry recognized Eleanor's eyes as identical to the vague image he had seen in his fragmented memories, while Thomas looked at Henry as if trying to match the face of the grown man before him with the 5-year-old child in his memory. The psychologist guided them to proceed step by step to reduce the pressure, and Eleanor was the first to speak, not with a question or explanation, but simply by calling his name Henry in the way a mother would call her child after years of longing, and when Henry responded with a very small movement, looking up, blinking slowly, then slightly bowing his head, that was enough to confirm the first emotional connection between them. To ensure the identification process was legally recognized, CMPD carried out the final step by comparing soft identity factors right there in the meeting. Henry had a small scar near his left eyebrow that the old medical records noted from when he fell off his bike at age 3. When Ellen mentioned this detail and Henry unconsciously reached up to touch the spot, the coordinating specialist noted this as the final confirmation needed to complete the legal procedures, affirming that Henry was indeed Henry Murphy. After this moment of confirmation, the meeting shifted from a cautious state to more natural emotions. Eleanor burst into tears when touching Henry's hand. Thomas stood beside her, unable to say anything except placing his hand on his son's shoulder, while Henry, though still confused, did not pull his hand away as his usual defensive reflex, a significant sign that he was accepting the connection taking place. Kendrick and the cold case unit observed from outside the room through one-way glass as per protocol. And upon seeing the meeting go well, they drafted the official report, changing the Henry Murphy case from missing to found, while closing the missing person investigation portion of the file, leaving the remaining part of the case related to Cooper's actions for separate process. Once CMPD completed the confirmation documents, and the family agreed to release the information after the meeting, the police department's communications unit began issuing a press release about Henry Murphy, missing, having been found alive and reunited with his family after 32 years. The news quickly spread throughout the Charlotte community and regional media, becoming one of the rare long-term missing person cases, with a complete reunion outcome. The widespread announcement not only served an informational purpose, but also marked the closure of the official investigation phase. The Henry Murphy missing person case was closed with the conclusion that the victim was alive, and subsequent developments belonged to the family, who had waited more than 3 decades for this moment, as well as to Henry, who now had to learn how to connect with his real life, after waiting for so long, under a different identity. The reunion's end did not mean everything immediately returned to normal, and Henry had to face a challenging adaptation period, as for the first time in his adult life, he had to live under his true identity, integrate into the biological family he no longer had clear memories of, and address the psychological gaps formed over years of isolation. Eleanor and Thomas tried to rebuild the relationship by creating the least pressured environment possible, not requiring Henry to recall childhood memories or pushing to make up for lost time, instead allowing him to adjust the level of interaction at his own pace, which helped Henry gradually feel safer in the new relationship. The extended family, cousins, distant relatives in Charlotte, gradually approached Henry through limited meetings to avoid overwhelming him, and over time, Henry began forming new emotional bonds based on current experiences rather than the fragmented past. Among these, the relationship between Henry and Thomas progressed slowly but steadily, with the two often spending time talking about the interests Henry had developed in his life as Daniel, from manual labor work to his independent living habits, creating common ground that allowed Henry to feel he didn't have to pretend to be someone else. In the Charlotte community, the news of Henry being found after 32 years became a widely discussed topic, not only because of the case's uniqueness, but also due to its impact on public awareness of long-term missing persons cases. Local media covered it respectfully, focusing on the investigation journey and the family's efforts rather than sensational aspects. And this positive response helped Henry's story become a prime example of not giving up hope in difficult missing persons cases. CMPD and other law enforcement agencies in the area were also influenced by the case, beginning to reassess existing cold cases, especially those lacking biological data, to prepare for updates using DNA like in Henry's case. Programs for collecting DNA from relatives of missing persons were expanded, and the Henry case became one of the reasons driving the establishment of standard procedures for old missing persons cases that had low chances of resolution. Legally, Raymond Cooper's status was updated through the prosecution process, and he was held in custody awaiting trial on charges related to the abduction, control, and concealment of a child for over 3 decades. Cooper's case set an important precedent due to the prolonged nature of the actions and the particularly severe impact on the victim, requiring prosecutors to consider multiple charges to fully reflect the crime's severity. The influence of the Henry case extended beyond Charlotte to missing persons investigation units across the southeastern United States, where agencies began reviewing child disappearance cases from the 1950s-1980s for the possibility of adult victims living under false identity. Similar to Henry, many families with cold cases began actively participating in DNA programs, and solved progress emerged in some cases previously considered unsolvable. In retrospect, the long-term impact of finding Henry lay not only in the outcome of one investigation, but also in its psychological and social effects. Proof that the combination of modern technology, family perseverance, and proper record preservation could unlock solutions to cases thought forgotten, while serving as motivation for the community and authorities to continue believing in the possibility of restoring justice, even after so much time had passed. Although the reunion had taken place and Henry's disappearance was legally resolved, the process of summarizing the file for the post-investigation phase revealed many gaps that no agency could fill. Starting with the most important question, why Henry, a child with no history of running away or family estrangement, followed Cooper in that final moment at Freedom Park. Henry no longer remembered clearly enough to describe the situation. And for a 5-year-old, being led away with just a few attention-grabbing actions or simple reassuring words was entirely possible. But no memory fragment was detailed enough to confirm whether he was coerced, enticed, or simply unaware of the danger, leaving Cooper's approach motive forever in the realm of hypothesis rather than concrete fact. Additionally, the question of whether Cooper had accomplices could not be fully answered. There was no evidence of a second person involved in taking Henry from Freedom Park, but the 8-minute timeline gap and the quick disappearance of the Bel Air raised the possibility that Cooper received some level of assistance, intentional or not. But with no new witnesses able to provide information after more than 3 decades, the investigation could not verify further. The anonymous letters that appeared in 1962, which once forced CMPD to divert resources in wrong directions, also remained an unsolved mystery. The handwriting could not be matched to any individual. There were no matching fingerprint, and the content, though containing a few details that seemed related to Freedom Park, was not specific enough to confirm whether the writer truly knew something or was just trying to create interference. When Kendrick reviewed them again, she concluded that the anonymous letters could have come from anyone in the Charlotte community at the time, and after more than 30 years, all tracing possibilities were no longer feasible. Many pieces of evidence collected in the initial investigation phase could not provide definitive answers. The hair found near the path was no longer of sufficient quality for modern analysis. Shoe prints and tire marks were damaged by civilians trampling during the spontaneous, and material fragments suspected to belong to the Bel Air were not stored to today's standards due to procedural limitations back then. When the state storage system re-examined all old evidence, many items had degraded or no longer retained original information, making forensic scene reconstruction nearly impossible. Therefore, even though Henry was found alive and Cooper was arrested, the case file remained technically incomplete. Too many questions could not be answered based on remaining data, and the nature of a case from the 1960s, with technological limitations, no DNA systems, and different investigative practices, meant many parts of the story had to accept being beyond verification. The Henry Murphy file was closed with a special note, "Missing person case resolved. Initial circumstances cannot be fully determined." This accurately reflected the reality that Kendrick and the entire cold case unit faced. The core truth, Henry was alive and his identity restored, had been confirmed. But the gaps surrounding Cooper's actions, the conditions of approaching Henry in those brief minutes, the existence of anonymous letters, and the possibility of assistance remained unanswered questions, leaving a permanent void in the overall picture of a case already eroded by time. From the moment the boy vanished from Freedom Park, in 1960 until he was found alive after 32 years, became a remarkable example of how a seemingly unsolvable missing person case could still open new paths. When technology, investigative methods, and storage systems advanced in time, this prolonged case-breaking process demonstrated that family perseverance, law enforcement efforts, and interagency cooperation could create breakthroughs, even when a case had been cold for decades. Reanalyzing old files, reviewing witness, cross-checking timelines, and reconstructing perpetrator behavior were foundational steps, while the key factor turning the case from deadlock to breakthrough was modern DNA technology. a tool that 1960 investigators could not have imagined existing. The emergence of relative DNA collection programs and integration of research data into CODIS opened a door no one previously saw, allowing the connection of Henry's DNA sample, coincidentally collected at an Atlanta clinic, with Eleanor's in North Carolina, creating the single but powerful intersection that pulled the case from darkness back into light. The biggest practical lesson in investigation came from the existence of seemingly unimportant small details. The old birthday card, sporadic moving history, inconsistencies in statements, and discrepancies in Cooper's paperwork. Each element alone was insufficient to solve the case, but when pieced together through a new lens, they formed a complete structure leading to the truth about Henry. This highlighted the importance of careful file preservation, maintaining evidence, even if unanalyzable at the time, and especially not discarding minor data just because it lacked meaning when collected. For the community, Henry's story deeply impacted Charlotte, reminding residents of the value of unity and patience in long-term missing persons cases. It also clarified that not every case ends in confirmed tragedy, and sometimes the best outcome comes from combining modern technology with the unwavering hope of the victim's family. The legal system also drew lessons when considering Cooper's responsibility for controlling the victim over decades, setting new precedents for handling perpetrators who caused harm not only at the abduction moment, but in the prolonged aftermath. Additionally, the Henry case contributed to innovation in cold case investigation, emphasizing the importance of reviewing old files with modern technology and standards. Many agencies revised evidence storage procedures, expanded family DNA sampling programs, and built dedicated cold case teams capable of multidisciplinary data connection. The case proved that although time can blur traces of truth, preserving records and applying technology at the right moment can restore what seemed lost, while affirming that justice, even arriving 3 decades late, holds immeasurable value for the victim's family, the community, and the entire investigative system. In today's America, the Henry Murphy story is not just a solved cold case file, but a clear mirror reflecting many issues that still exist. In 1960, the family let Henry play at Freedom Park because they believed in safe neighborhoods. Adults lost vigilance for just a few minutes, and a strange man prepared with a light blue Bel Air exploited exactly that gap. Today, parents in Charlotte or any U.S. city can still easily fall into the feeling that this area is all families, it'll be fine. The first lesson: child safety doesn't lie in feeling, but in systems. Clear rules about who is allowed to pick up or take children, teaching kids rules, like not going with strangers, even if they say your parents asked me to come, and not downplaying moments of distraction in parks, parking lots, or shopping centers. Henry's story also shows the value of record preservation and persistent searching. Ross's 1960 report, Evidence Once Thought Useless, Eleanor's DNA in CODIS, Daniel's sample, accidentally left at an Atlanta clinic, all linked thanks to technology, and because the family never gave up. In modern life, when a loved one goes missing, proactively providing DNA saving documents, emails, photos, journals, can be the key to the future, not just for months, but possibly years later. Finally, the way Henry had to learn to live again under his real name reminds us in today's United States that surviving trauma is one journey, while rebuilding a life is another, requiring time, therapy, respect for personal boundaries, rather than pressuring victims to feel grateful or forgive, according to societal expectation. Thank you for joining us on this emotional 32-year case closure journey. If you'd like to continue exploring stories of justice found after darkness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where every old file might hold a new truth waiting to be revealed.